Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World, and here is today's content. The journey of Syria's leader from a man once branded as an international pariah carrying a $10 million bounty on his head to a guest welcomed within the walls of the White House marks one of the most striking reversals in recent geopolitical memory. For the first time in over a decade, Washington's gesture toward Damascus represents something larger than diplomacy. It is the symbolic acknowledgement that the old moral architecture of global politics, the world of punishment, sanctions, and isolation, is beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Jeffrey Sachs would describe this transformation as the metamorphosis of necessity. No state changes its moral calculus out of sudden enlightenment. It does so because the costs of hostility begin to outweigh the rewards of principle. For the United States, Syria's slow rehabilitation is not a confession of past misjudgment. It is the pragmatic realization that permanent enmity has become an unaffordable luxury. After 2 decades of Middle Eastern interventionism that drained both treasure and trust, Washington now faces a multipolar world where diplomacy is cheaper than domination. The symbolism of this moment runs deeper than the political theater of red carpets and handshakes. It signals a shift from the era of moral absolutism, the belief that nations could be neatly divided into allies and adversaries, toward an age of transactional realism. Syria, once cast as the villain of Western narratives, becomes a test case for this new pragmatism. Its return to dialogue demonstrates that legitimacy in the 21st century is no longer a function of moral standing, but of geopolitical utility. For Damascus, the visit is more than a diplomatic rehabilitation. It is a step toward economic oxygen. Years of war and sanctions have hollowed out the Syrian economy, erasing infrastructure, collapsing currency, and driving millions into exile. To be invited back into the conversation, even symbolically, is to regain access, however partial, to the networks of aid, investment, and trade that define global participation. But Sachs would caution that such legitimacy granted by foreign powers is conditional and fragile. It does not erase the scars of the past. It merely freezes them under the ice of temporary necessity. At the same time, this symbolic gesture reveals something essential about the decline of Western moral authority. The United States, once the self-declared arbiter of global legitimacy, is now forced into selective forgiveness, not because the world has changed morally, but because it has changed structurally. The old model of isolation, sanctions, exclusion, and rhetorical demonization no longer delivers political results in a world where China, Russia, and regional powers provide alternative pathways for survival. Thus, the Syrian leader's White House visit is not the triumph of reconciliation. It is the funeral of certainty. The bounty, once a symbol of America's moral, will now stand as a relic of a fading empire, learning to negotiate with those it once sought to destroy. As Sachs might put it, empires do not lose their power in a single war. They lose it in the moment they realize that punishment no longer pays. For Syria, the shift from isolation to tentative engagement with Washington carries profound economic implications. Behind the political theater of diplomacy lies the more urgent question: can rapprochement translate into material recovery for a nation shattered by war, sanctions, and systemic poverty? The Syrian economy today is not merely weak, it is structurally devastated, an economy functioning in fragments, sustained by informal networks, remittances, and black market trade. A visit to Washington may offer a symbolic victory, but the real test lies in whether that symbolism can open the channels of capital, credit, and confidence that define modern recovery. Jeffrey Sachs would begin by recalling that sanctions, though framed as instruments of justice, are in practice instruments of economic suffocation. For over a decade, the Caesar Act and related measures have frozen Syria's access to the global financial system. Banks avoid transactions linked to Syrian entities for fear of secondary sanctions. Humanitarian imports are slowed by compliance bureaucracy, and reconstruction projects estimated at over $400 billion in cost remain indefinitely deferred. The result is a society trapped in economic stasis. Prices surge, the Syrian pound collapses, and skilled labor continues to flee. In this context, even the faint possibility of U.S. engagement is transformative. A single diplomatic opening could allow limited sanctions, relief exemptions for reconstruction aid, reopening of remittance channels, or licensing for energy and infrastructure projects. These gestures, while modest in policy terms, could have outsized psychological impact. They would signal to investors, international NGOs, and regional partners that Syria's reintegration is no longer taboo. In Sachs's framing, this would mark the first breath after financial asphyxiation, where legitimacy itself becomes a form of liquidity. But Sachs would also warn that such recovery is structurally fragile. Without governance reform, transparency, and institutional rebuilding, new money will not create sustainable growth. It will simply reinforce the rentier patterns that led to collapse in the first place. Reconstruction aid channeled through politically connected elites risks becoming a new layer of patronage rather than a foundation for renewal. This is the paradox of post-war economies. Foreign capital returns before justice does. If Syria's re-engagement with the U.S. yields investment without accountability, it may stabilize the regime, but not the republic. At the same time, a shift in U.S. posture could embolden other actors, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and even European intermediaries, to re-engage economically under Washington's implicit approval. For Damascus, this represents not just access to capital, but a chance to rebalance its dependencies away from a single bloc. The inflow of Gulf reconstruction funds, if properly managed, could begin rebuilding vital sectors, electricity, transport, healthcare, and education. Yet Sachs would note that the timing of such aid matters as much as its scale. Without a parallel easing of financial restrictions, Syria's recovery risks becoming a mirage, visible in statistics but absent in the lives of ordinary citizens. In the global context, Washington's willingness to engage economically reflects not compassion but strategic recalibration. The U.S. has learned from Iraq and Afghanistan that destruction without reconstruction breeds geopolitical vacuums easily filled by Russia, Iran, or China. By permitting Syria limited access to global markets, Washington reclaims leverage at minimal cost. Sachs would see this as both pragmatic and cynical, a humanitarian gesture cloaked in realpolitik. Thus, Syria's economic revival, if it comes, will not be born of justice or repentance, but of exhaustion, a world tired of isolation and searching for equilibrium. Sachs would conclude that the challenge now is not whether Syria re-enters the global economy, but on whose terms. If it re-enters as a supplicant of geopolitics, it will repeat the past. If it re-enters as a partner in reform, it might just rediscover sovereignty. The difference lies not in the lifting of sanctions, but in the lifting of illusions. Syria's symbolic return to Washington is not an isolated diplomatic gesture. It is a strategic tremor felt most acutely in Moscow and Beijing. For nearly a decade, Russia and China have anchored Syria's survival, providing political protection, economic lifelines, and in Moscow's case, direct military intervention. Damascus's sudden reappearance on the stage of Western diplomacy thus introduces a profound uncertainty. Has Syria begun to drift from its eastern patrons, or is it using the West to renegotiate its value within the emerging multipolar order? Jeffrey Sachs would describe this development as the realignment within the realignment. In his view, geopolitics is not a fixed chessboard, but a constantly shifting mosaic of opportunism. For Russia, Syria has never been merely a client state. It has been a projection of endurance, the demonstration that Moscow can protect its allies where Washington retreats. Russia's military presence in Latakia and Tartus, its airbase leases, and its control over portions of Syrian energy infrastructure are symbols of its restored great power status. A U.S. invitation to Damascus threatens to dilute that narrative, transforming Syria from an exclusive Russian protectorate into a shared diplomatic asset. Yet Sachs would caution that Russia's response will be pragmatic, not emotional. Moscow understands that economic stagnation and sanctions have limited its own ability to bankroll Syrian reconstruction. If Washington's re-engagement leads to partial Western funding or Gulf investment, Russia may quietly welcome the relief so long as its strategic foothold remains intact. In essence, Russia's calculus is defensive, preserve influence, while outsourcing Syria's economic burdens to the same powers that once sought its downfall. This is the realism of exhaustion, Sachs might say, when even empires recognize the limits of loyalty amid scarcity. For China, the implications are more layered. Beijing has long viewed Syria as a potential node in its Belt and Road Initiative, a bridge connecting Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Chinese firms constrained by Western sanctions have kept their involvement cautious but steady, investing in infrastructure, surveys, telecom projects, and limited oil ventures. A thaw between Washington and Damascus could complicate this strategy. On one hand, it may ease the financial constraints that hinder Chinese investment. On the other, it reintroduces American oversight into a region where Beijing prefers ambiguity. Sachs would interpret China's position as a philosophy of patience, allowing others to restore Syria's legitimacy, then entering quietly to harvest the benefits. What both Russia and China share is an understanding that Syria's new diplomacy reflects not betrayal but balance. Damascus has learned from 2 decades of isolation that survival depends on diversification. A meeting with the White House is not a pivot away from Moscow or Beijing. It is a bid to multiply bargaining options. Sachs might call this the art of small state sovereignty, the ability of a weakened nation to play the giants against each other in order to regain a semblance of independence. However, both great powers will watch this development with cautious calculation. Russia will test whether engagement undermines its military access or political leverage. China will monitor whether Washington's hand in Syria expands into containment of its broader Eurasian ambitions. For them, Syria's diplomatic rehabilitation is less about Damascus itself and more about the contours of global order, whether multipolarity remains stable or whether it begins to fragment under new alliances of convenience. Sachs would summarize this moment as a lesson in transactional modernity. The world's great powers no longer fight to dominate territory, but to monetize stability. If Syria's re-entry into Western diplomacy allows Russia to secure its bases and China to resume infrastructure expansion, both may publicly feign irritation while privately counting gains. Yet the moral cost, Sachs would warn, is profound. The global system, once governed by principles, now functions through managed contradictions, where yesterday's enemy becomes today's investment and diplomacy no longer redeems it, merely recalibrates. Behind the theatrics of invitation and handshake, Washington's outreach to Damascus reveals a deeper shift, not toward moral reconciliation, but toward strategic recalibration. The United States has finally begun to acknowledge what Jeffrey Sachs has long warned, that the age of unipolar dominance is over, and that influence in the modern world is no longer won by isolation, but by selective inclusion. In this context, the Syrian leader's visit to the White House is not an act of forgiveness, but a maneuver in a larger chess game of global equilibrium. For over a decade, U.S. policy towards Syria was built on the logic of containment. By enforcing sanctions, freezing reconstruction aid, and maintaining limited military presence in the country's northeast, Washington aimed to deny Damascus economic recovery while avoiding direct confrontation. Yet, containment, Sachs would argue, is a strategy suited to a static world, and the world has moved on. As Russia entrenched itself militarily in Syria and China quietly expanded economic ties across the region, the United States found itself managing a vacuum of its own creation. The invitation to Damascus is thus less a reversal of policy than an admission of obsolescence. Sachs would frame this in moral terms. Empires rarely apologize for their failures. They simply redesign them. The White House, by opening its doors to the Syrian leadership, seeks not to heal the past, but to reclaim leverage in the present. Through dialogue, Washington can reinsert itself into the regional equation without deploying troops or spending billions. In the language of realpolitik, this is the move from hard power to smart presence, engagement without commitment, influence without ownership. Economically, this recalibration serves U.S. interests as much as it benefits Syria. Washington understands that by easing certain sanctions or facilitating limited trade access, it can reduce Russian and Iranian dominance over Syrian reconstruction. Every dollar of Western aid or Gulf investment entering Syria dilutes the monopoly Moscow and Tehran built during the years of isolation. This is the economics of dilution, eroding the influence of rivals, not through confrontation, but through gradual economic infiltration. Sachs would recognize this as the 21st century version of the Marshall logic, the use of financial access, not military force, to reshape political loyalties. Regionally, the strategy also fits into a broader pattern of Middle Eastern recalibration. The United States, having witnessed the rise of new mediators like China in the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, now faces the need to reassert symbolic centrality in a region that has begun to drift away. By engaging Damascus, Washington repositions itself as an indispensable broker, once again a gesture to remind the world that even in decline, it remains the arbiter of legitimacy. Yet Sachs would note that this shift carries its own contradictions. The same administration that once justified sanctions on human rights grounds now extends an invitation without accountability. Such reversals reveal the erosion of moral coherence within Western diplomacy. The West, Sachs might say, has become a mirror of the very pragmatism it once condemned. What was once sold as a moral crusade has devolved into a negotiation of convenience, a quiet recognition that power now flows not from principles, but from the flexibility to abandon them. This transformation, however, is not merely cynical. It is strategic adaptation. The United States is learning to operate in a world of limited dominance, where influence must be earned through participation, not coercion. Re-engaging Syria allows Washington to reopen dialogue with the Arab League, temper Iranian reach, and slow Chinese infrastructural penetration, all without major cost. Sachs would see this as both a symptom of imperial fatigue and a sign of geopolitical maturity, the realization that hegemony sustained through dialogue is still hegemony, only in a subtler form. In essence, the Syrian visit to the White House marks America's reluctant embrace of realism, the transition from the moral absolutism of the 2000s to the strategic ambiguity of the 2022. Sachs would likely summarize this turn with quiet irony. When an empire grows tired of fighting, it does not surrender, it negotiates. And in negotiation, even the enemy finds a seat at the table. Thus, Washington's motive is neither idealism nor repentance. It is survival in a multipolar world. The handshake with Syria is not the end of conflict, but the beginning of a new geometry of influence, one where power must be shared and dominance must disguise itself as diplomacy. At its deepest level, Syria's return to Washington is not simply a diplomatic event, but a moral paradox, a moment that forces the world to confront the uneasy boundary between reconciliation and expediency. In the language of Jeffrey Sachs, it represents the tragedy of necessary compromise when justice and pragmatism no longer travel together and states must choose which to preserve. For the United States, welcoming a leader once vilified as a pariah raises fundamental questions about the moral architecture of foreign policy. If moral condemnation can be so easily reversed by political necessity, then what remains of the ethical claims that once justified intervention, sanction, and isolation? Sachs would argue that this episode exposes the collapse of the Western moral monopoly, the era in which Washington could define legitimacy through ideology has ended. In its place rises a transactional global order, one governed less by right and wrong than by balance and endurance. For Syria, the moral tension cuts both ways. The visit to the White House may project dignity abroad, but it does not erase the economic and humanitarian devastation at home. Infrastructure lies in ruins, youth unemployment exceeds 50%, and much of the nation's educated class has emigrated. The lifting of sanctions or resumption of aid can provide oxygen, but not life. The global implications are equally profound. The re-entry of Syria into Western diplomacy underscores the world's drift toward a multipolar pragmatism. Russia, China, the U.S., and regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Turkey are no longer engaged in ideological competition, but in the management of instability. Syria becomes both symbol and laboratory for this new order, a test of whether rival powers can share influence without rekindling war. Sachs would interpret this as the next phase of globalization, not an age of unity, but one of negotiated coexistence. Economically, such coexistence demands a rethinking of Reconstruction itself. Sachs might call for a global reconstruction compact, a coalition of international and regional partners coordinating aid, energy access, and debt relief in return for governance reforms. The point he would emphasize is not to reward regimes, but to stabilize societies. In the 21st century, he might write, "Peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of functioning institutions." Yet Sachs would end on a note of philosophical sobriety. The White House handshake does not resolve the contradictions of the past, it exposes them. The same forces that bring adversaries together, exhaustion, necessity, and economic interdependence, can also erode the very principles that once gave diplomacy, meaning the risk is that reconciliation becomes performance peace as optics, not transformation. A world that forgives without reflection, Sachs might conclude, may regain stability, but it loses its soul. Still, he would argue there is no turning back. The global system, fragile and fatigued, must now learn to function in moral twilight, where cooperation and compromise coexist with memory and guilt. Syria's visit to Washington is a symbol of that twilight, a reminder that history does not move in lines of justice or ideology, but in circles of necessity. The challenge for the world, Sachs would say, is to ensure that those circles eventually spiral upward toward a peace that is not only pragmatic, but principled, a diplomacy that redeems rather than merely rearranges.